It is a bright sunny day. It is June 16th, 2025. Today we will be hearing from an analyst that has a good track record and whose information I do trust. We'll go over the updates on the US China trade talks and how there is a duality in how bad the economic conditions are, but yet at the same time, there are economic indicators that measure that there is actually a good outlook in the future of the economy. So stick around to the end because there is something important that we need to discuss about how things stand as of now and where they will be going. So let's get this started.
Like what we've had with China and sort of miscellaneous walkbacks. But a broader deal with a deficit country has not been reached yet since Liberation Day. However, now there is talk that the US and Vietnam are closing in also on a framework trade agreement. Now, what's interesting about this is currently reciprocal tariffs against Vietnam, which is really big for furniture manufacturing, and restoration hardware. I'm pretty sure does quite a bit of their manufacturing out of Vietnam. Apparently, there is talk of a framework for a deal with Vietnam. Vietnam is seeking to secure tariffs in the range of 20 to 25%, said people interviewed by Bloomberg, but asking not to be identified because the discussions are still private. The agreement would include a series of U.S. demands, such as stricter enforcement against Chinese trans-shipping, basically the non-tariff barriers. Vietnam had earlier offered to remove all tariffs, as well as step up trade enforcement and boost purchases of American goods. However, right now it still looks like they're going to end up with some tariff level around 20 to 25%. And this is actually interesting because, you're at 10% now, which means we would end up with, yes, more tariffs and more tariff revenue for the United States, but actually a higher level of tariffs that could potentially create more deadweight loss in the economy than we had previously anticipated. A lot of the Federal Reserve right now is hoping that tariffs end up somewhere around an average of 18%, averaging China into that on a trade-weighted basis. Anything more than that is something that could potentially crimp the economy more so than the Federal Reserve expects. This would be above that average at 20 to 25%. However, quote unquote, the final contours of the framework are still being fleshed out in ways that need to secure President Trump's sign off. Vietnam's foreign ministry has not responded, neither has the White House. Trump so far has struggled to reach trade deals for his July 9th deadline. We still have about 3 weeks there. Donald Trump has also suggested that he intends to send letters for basically like take it or leave it offers for trade. It's like, we will just peg your tariff amount at X and go from there. However, even talk about deals like this around this 20 to 25% level for Vietnam, probably good for setting up the potential for making deals with other countries. So I'd say this is broadly optimistic, even though the tariff levels are higher than would ordinarily be desirable. Vietnam did offer the promise of a quick solution. However, we still need to ink the deal, yes. Some officials want to calibrate tariffs for Vietnam and other Southeast Asians to ensure they are sufficiently lower than what's being imposed on China. Yet if they're too low, the rates may only exacerbate Vietnam's high trade surplus with the U.S. and encourage further shipment of Chinese goods through the country. So in other words, if you keep like 55% on China, you want tariffs to be high enough on Vietnam that people aren't incentivized to funnel stuff to Vietnam and then to America, but you want them to be, high enough to still collect revenue also from Vietnam, because that is part of Donald Trump's big goal. Is Donald Trump loves this idea of revenue from tariffs, and that's obviously the broader risk for the U.S. economy, is that Donald Trump becomes addicted with the idea of tariffs to the point where it actually ends up crimping parts of the U.S. economy. Now,
So, a good example of what he just talked about, and this is one of the many theories that I've thought in my head and I've discussed with a lot of different people. And of course, they're going to disagree with me because they think it's something too crazy that can never be conceived of by, our elected officials. Um, he talks about how Trump won't sacrifice much of the economy for the sake of his tariffs. That is true. We have not seen that happen yet, and I don't think we ever will. The tariffs is like a political machine that he's been built up. I mean, if I'm being honest, it probably won him the election. But this isn't a video or a channel about politics. We don't discuss that here. We just follow the money. We just, follow the economic forces for a better tomorrow for ourselves so we can thrive by taking action, of course. So, really quick, one thing that we seen was when the 90-day grace period came about, the trucking companies, the shipping industries were in utter chaos and fear because if it had gone for any week, any month longer without the 90-day grace period, you would have mass unemployment across all these different sectors of the shipping industries, right? So you have this 90-day grace period and it gave these trucking, employers a salvation. And this is one of the many things that has led me to believe that these tariffs are a way to disrupt the economy, but at the same time, grant the markets their salvation by not going through with these tariffs. But that's an entirely different video. It's a different topic. And if you want to hear more about this, stay tuned in the future. And I'll break down that timeline from the fear that came about of Trump announcing that there will be tariffs, Liberation Day coming, the reaction of a lot of different employers in different, sectors in the economy. Shipping is one of them, and how it relates. But for now, let's continue with this video.
Right now, optimism is very, very high. But if we look at the Empire Manufacturing Survey, I think you could see that, there are underlying cracks that we want to pay attention to. If you look at the full report here from this morning's Empire Manufacturing Survey, which took, this survey took place between June 2nd and June 9th. So broadly in sort of the current state of where we are with the economy. Manufacturing activity actually fell for a fourth consecutive month in New York State. The Empire Manufacturing is just related to New York State, so it's not sort of a full U.S. picture. But it gives you a very interesting POV. It says manufacturing's down, unfilled orders decline, so they're able to catch up on orders. They're also pointing to a decline in orders and shipments, which isn't good, right? So business conditions are actually getting worse. However, firms are becoming more positive, which is this interesting duality. You're in an environment right now where capital spending plans are soft, but people are optimistic for future business conditions. They're optimistic about taco or whatever. Trump always chickens out, or a trade framework's coming, or American exceptionalism, or whatever. And we actually ended up getting an increase in employees, the first positive reading since January, even though the average work week declined 1.5 hours. So you're really in this sort of weird place where pricing power is weak, the economy isn't exactly booming in terms of companies' abilities to raise prices and consumer spending, again, with new orders and shipments declining. But there's so much optimism around, hey, as we get deals, as we get a resumption of the norm, maybe these new order declines will prove to be temporary, and we can get back to optimism. So these are all current conditions here. If we go to forward-looking indicators, you can see here's that optimism, which is basically V-shaped recovering. Interestingly, looking forward, there's the belief that we are going to see more new orders and more shipments, but we're not seeing that in the current conditions. So hope with new orders and shipments expected to increase, but again, not being met by present data. However, I would argue that if we ended up getting a deal with a deficit country like Vietnam, it would broadly be optimistic. It's possible that's why we're starting to see some rise on restoration hardware.
If you want to watch more of this, I'll leave a link down below to his channel in that specific video. But here's the question that lies. Where are things going to take a turn for the worse or for the better? When it comes to the economic stage that has been set, ultimately, this does affect you and me. That's the bottom line. So, I have so many things to talk about, but I'll leave this as a teaser for future topics. I would not be surprised at all with a lot of these trade negotiations to not come through. What do I mean by that? So, from there being nothing reached after 90 days, from the grace period between China and the US, to other negotiations that the US is engaged with, like countries like Vietnam, These things, I would not be surprised if they do not go through. It will be done on purpose, and the design is to keep this a long drawn thing where the economic conditions slightly deteriorate. And honestly, this is like some sort of form of a recessionless recession, who knows? But be careful with your spending, stay within your means, and you won't have fear and uncertainty in your mind. Why would the Trump admin want this? It is because what the Trump admin has said that they hope to achieve with the tariffs, like bringing back manufacturing and being self reliant, and all that good stuff, it's not really their goal. That's kind of makes no sense when I say it, but that is not their goal. These tariffs serve an ulterior purpose, ulterior motives that are much more sinister. I want to discuss all of this in, future videos in the related specific topics, so stay tuned for that. And as always, remember, control your own economy.